Within this video, I will seek to point out the recurring similarity between a Western folktale and various Greco-Roman myths. Let us begin. If you've watched any previous videos on this channel, you may have noticed my fondness for the cultural significance of folklore surrounding the legend of the 15th century scholar and astrologer Johann Georg Faust. The first subsequent folktale was originally known as Dr. Faustus and was actually written in circa 1592 by the English playwright and poet Christopher Marlowe. The play was later adapted as Faust, written in 1808 by German polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It ought to be rather obvious that I appreciate the tale. For one thing, it is in the name of the channel. This is the story from which the cultural motif of the Faustian bargain, or a deal with the devil, originates. Faust is largely successful, but ultimately dissatisfied with his life, and is seeking more from it. This strong desire leads him to make a pact with Mephistopheles, who works as an agent for the devil Lucifer. Initially, Mephistopheles warns Faust of the choice he has, and tells him that the pact would mean selling his soul in exchange for what Faust desires, which is greater power and ultimate knowledge. Consequently, Faust is tricked and enticed by what may appear to be worldly power and knowledge, but of course the devil knows that power and knowledge, whilst being significant concepts, are not concrete or finite, but transcendental and thus unattainable by man. Particularly in the case of knowledge, there is so much potential knowledge to be attained that to assume one could possibly possess it all in a finite lifetime is nothing short of foolish. Whilst it is a worthwhile pursuit and will improve one's life to a great extent initially, yet one must learn and acknowledge that it is impossible to know all that can be known, or in another context, it is impossible to attain a universal utopia on earth, or to reach the height of gods as mere men. Thus, pragmatically speaking, because of this impossibility, there is an inherent danger attached to the relentless pursuit of temptations, dreams, and hubristic ambitions. That's not to suggest that goals and tasks aren't a necessity in life. It's just meant to point out that there are often unintended consequences for what may seem to be good or virtuous intentions. The well-known aphorism of "the road to hell is paved with good intentions" has immense historical and cultural significance, the resemblance and origins of which range from Virgil's Aeneid, as the descent to hell is easy, as well as religious scripture in Ecclesiasticus 21:10, as the way of sinners is made plain with stones, but at the end thereof is the pit of hell. And even within the Islamic Hadith, as paradise is surrounded by hardships and the fire is surrounded by desires. Coincidentally, within Virgil's Aeneid is another famous aphorism, "Fortune favours the bold," which itself has a number of variations. Yes, it is bold and brave to willingly go through the underworld or willingly stare into the abyss and keep going or keep staring in the Herculean or Nietzschean sense. But when one has good intentions, one does not anticipate a bad outcome and is certainly not willing for such an outcome to occur. But it can and does occur outside of our control, especially once we give up that control to fate or chance or a force outside of ourselves. Faust initially had good intentions. He wanted to feel greater satisfaction in life. On face value, this is a perfectly reasonable thing to wish for, but eventually he was clearly consumed by that desire. and so whilst it may have appeared innocent and well-meaning at first, it quickly manifested into something tragic and unavoidable because of the pact he willingly made. If one ever takes a considerable interest in Greco-Roman mythology, they will eventually find that many of the stories of classic mythology seem to depend primarily upon the Roman poet Ovid and his magnum opus. He was a contemporary of Virgil and Horace, and together the trio are renowned as the three canonical poets of Latin literature. Beginning with the creation of the world and ending with Rome in Ovid's own lifetime, the Metamorphoses is described as a work that drags the reader through time and space, from beginnings to endings, from life to death, from moments of delicious joy to episodes of depravity and abjection. Such is life, Ovid would say. The main theme of the work, as the title suggests, is one that deeply explores the change or transformation that is present in life. Ovid was a compendium of mythology and appears to be the first writer of his era who took it upon himself to create what is effectively a compilation of the ancient myths, an arduous task indeed. From this point on, the myths that I will discuss in this video can thus be found detailed or referenced within Ovid's work. If one is familiar with the 20th century German philosopher Oswald Spengler, it would surely not be a stretch to assert that some parallels between Ovid and Spengler can be found. Whilst it's self-evident that they were both exceptional thinkers, neither can necessarily lay claim to being the best or most popular writers of their time, but both left an indelible mark on history and culture. Like Ovid's compilation, Spengler's unabridged magnum opus Decline of the West was not necessarily an entirely original work, or even an entirely original theory of history, as he no doubt drew great inspiration from the cyclical thought of Vico, Goethe's Metamorphosis of Plants, and the life-affirming worldview of Nietzsche. But Spengler was basically just the first thinker of his time who was visionary and conscientious enough to even attempt and ultimately succeed in his goal of amalgamating thousands of years of thought and foresight into one exceptionally elegant and coherent work. Spengler's magnum opus was an example of brilliant yet surprising scholarship, especially since it came from a man who was originally a mere relatively unknown high school mathematics teacher, but who was obviously imbued with a cultured soul of incredible passion. At the time of publication, Decline of the West wasn't understood, or perhaps appreciated to the degree that Spengler had hoped, despite selling well enough at the time to give Spengler a minor celebrity status. The book was considered too intellectual, and many purchased it under the impression that the notion of decline was simply a commentary on the state of the world after World War I, not the extraordinarily ambitious yet foreboding and life-changing experience that it proves to be. Basically, the average reader at the time got way more than they bargained for from the book, and didn't see it for the masterpiece that it is. Decline of the West has only recently gained greater traction in the modern epoch, as Spengler's prophetic warnings appear to be materializing more and more clearly. But once again, only an intellectual and cultured minority is even aware of this. Nowadays, Spengler is still more obscure than he ought to be. As Theodore Adorno once wrote, Oswald Spengler will have his revenge for being forgotten by threatening to be right. If you were to have a conversation with the average reader, they may be able to tell you of an entry-level understanding of mythology, possibly a basic description of Hercules or Achilles. But Ovid's impact, albeit significant, goes unnoticed by many in today's world. Tragically, the average reader would probably not be able to tell you anything about Metamorphoses, despite the considerable influence it exerted upon literature and the arts, particularly in the West. The scholar and translator A.D. Melville once said that it may be doubted whether any poem has had so great an influence on the literature and art of Western civilization as the Metamorphoses. Within this context, a question could be raised as to whether the poet or hero is more important to the development of culture. The poet being the man of imagination, the hero being the man of action. Evidently, both play their part significantly. The hero may carry out many deeds, but it is the poet who romanticizes those deeds for consumption by the masses, thus building the legend of the hero to be more significant than it initially was, and ensuring the hero lives on with inflated words and fantastic tales for all eternity, long after the hero has perished. It could also be argued that the hero can be a manifestation of the poet's mind, and not even necessarily real or based on a real person, just an expression of the poet's ideal, an ideal that is passed down by other poets preceding him. People admire Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, and Samwise Gamgee, but they are just modernized and exaggerated dreamlike examples of ancient archetypal stories and characters. Stories and characters that were no doubt exaggerated dreams themselves. But sometimes the exaggeration is necessary, as it ultimately seeks to demonstrate that we can be better than we are. And if we are to actually become better, we have to first believe in the dream that we can be better. But that exaggerated dream, whilst necessary, is still exceedingly dangerous, as the human mind is capable of bringing forth both great creation and great destruction. The suggestion that Western civilization is Promethean in nature is rather profound and possibly accurate. Given Western civilization is the dominant civilization of our time, it can be argued from a Western-centric position that man in the universal sense is also Promethean in nature. As in Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan, cultural hero, trickster, and ultimate friend of man, who defied the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity, an act that enabled progress and civilization, thus transforming the world. By doing so, Prometheus clearly considers himself the measure of all things. However, for this trickery and arrogant act of defiance, Prometheus was swiftly punished by the gods and sentenced to eternal torment for his transgression. The gods thereby demonstrate that while Prometheus, or man, may be the measure of all things, because he foolishly dabbled with forces far beyond his comprehension, he is in no way the master of all things, and may well be subject to the will of the gods, or in another sense, subject to the organic revenge of nature against him. There is a lesson here about unintended consequences, the risk of overreaching, and the resultant tragedy that could come from endless expansion or endless societal progression. As such, Western man's greatest strength, the desire to push for the infinite, is also his greatest weakness, as it may lead to his downfall, very much like a double-edged sword. The deity Apollo was known among other things as the god of hunting, and after a remarkable feat of hunting, he insults the archery skills of Eros, or Cupid, and so in retaliation, Eros prepares two cursed arrows, one of gold and one of lead. The gold arrow strikes Apollo and leaves him infatuated with Daphne, the beautiful tree spirit and daughter of Peneus, a river god, whilst the lead arrow strikes Daphne and leaves her filled with fear, disgust, and hatred of Apollo. As Daphne was considered Apollo's first love, he pursued her hastily, pleading with her to slow down and let him embrace her. Daphne, however, is overcome with anxiety and prays to her father to help her escape and turn into a laurel tree, the leaves of which become the ceremonial wreaths that Apollo gifts to champions and leaders as a symbol of victory. Whilst in this instance Apollo could be interpreted as lust and Daphne as chastity, author Joseph Campbell interprets Apollo as extreme-willed extroversion, total embrace of the call to adventure, and Daphne as extreme-willed introversion, total refusal of the call to adventure. He writes, "Willed introversion, in fact, is one of the classic implements of creative genius and can be employed as a deliberate device. It drives the psychic energies into depth and activates the lost continent of unconscious, infantile, and archetypal images. The result, of course, may be a disintegration of consciousness more or less complete, i.e., neurosis, psychosis, the plight of the spellbound Daphne. But on the other hand, if the personality is able to absorb and integrate the new forces, there will be experienced an almost superhuman degree of self-consciousness and masterful control. The deep brooding intellect or genius thinker is thus typically introverted, whilst the archetypal man of action is not deep nor intellectual, but naturally daring, adventurous, and relaxed in his interactions with the world. Ideally, one should either find a balance of both characteristics or just pursue one of them wholeheartedly. A young man by the name of Actaeon had spent all day in the forest hunting with his fellow companions and their dogs. A weary Actaeon strays from the pathway home and seeks a place to rest. In the midst of a well-earned break, Actaeon is startled and then intrigued by what sounds like laughter coming from deep within the forest. Against his better judgment, and no doubt governed by some sense of lust, a curious Actaeon seeks out the noise. The wanderer is then shocked when he stumbles upon a group of beautiful women bathing and splashing around in a secluded pool, all of them naked. No sooner does Actaeon realize where he is, before a chorus of screams echo through the woods. Each woman clamors to cover up as they shield the hunter goddess Artemis from Actaeon's prying eyes. But Artemis knows it is too late. Actaeon has seen her, the most beautiful woman of all, completely naked. Artemis is angered by the man's intrusion, and she taunts him, saying he has just seen a nude goddess, and should leave and tell his companions, that is, if he can. In a fit of rage, she puts a curse on Actaeon, turning him into a stag. Suddenly, the man sprouts a pair of antlers, and his hands and feet become hooves. Actaeon then sees his reflection in the water, and is horrified, racing away immediately. A moment passes, and he briefly feels at ease when he hears his hounds approaching. But anxiety grips him yet again when he realizes he cannot call out to them. The hounds, acting on instinct, grab the stag and tear into him, completely unaware that they are tearing into their master. Actaeon's companions soon arrive, encouraging the dogs for their find. The men then deliver the death blow to the stag. Artemis, who is miraculously aware of the scenario and of Actaeon's terrible fate, now rests contented. Thus it could be argued that Actaeon was obviously punished for doing something he shouldn't have, for peeking behind the metaphorical curtain, because like so many weary travellers before him, he was perhaps tempted by the ancient motif of the siren's song, which is a reoccurring theme in Greek mythology. Regardless of his motivation, he could not avert his gaze from the beauty of the sacred deity, and this was deemed as blasphemous. As an ironic aside, it is interesting to note that despite the myth explicitly stating that viewing a goddess naked is sacrilegious, later artistic depictions of the myth do exactly that, and the classical masters paint her naked. although not in a vulgar or perverted fashion, but rather as an accurate recounting of Ovid's version of the much-storied myth. Much like the tales of Hercules and Achilles, the myth of Icarus is well known. It is commonly referred to in basic terms as being a classic example of man's hubris. But it should be noted that the build-up to the tragic crescendo of Icarus flying too close to the sun involves a number of other interesting myths that intermingle and essentially form a cause and effect phenomenon, like the tumbling of a row of dominoes. Prior to the birth of his son, Icarus's father, Daedalus, was a highly respected inventor, craftsman, and sculptor in Athens. Legend has it that he invented carpentry and all the tools used for it. He also made a series of other inventions crucial to the development of the classical culture and civilization. Whilst he was obviously highly skilled and celebrated as a master of his craft by many, Daedalus was extremely envious of the talents and potential of his apprentice, his nephew, commonly referred to as Perdix. Daedalus didn't want to share the spotlight with his nephew, so one day in a fit of jealousy, Daedalus threw Perdix off of the top of a temple on the Acropolis. The temple in question was the temple of the goddess Athena. The deity witnessed the commotion and intervened, transforming Perdix into a partridge and ensuring that he was saved from falling to his death. As punishment for his actions, Daedalus was banished from Athens and sent to Crete. With his reputation of technical talent preceding him, Daedalus was welcomed to Crete by King Minos. Minos bestowed the title of the palace's technical advisor upon Daedalus. Therefore, it seemed Daedalus was on a path to redemption, as he was given the opportunity to continue his work as an inventor and push the boundaries of innovation. Daedalus invented the ship sail and mast, allowing for sailors to control the wind. With every new invention, Daedalus challenged the perceived limits of man and began to bridge the gap that separated humanity from the gods, until finally he went too far. Meanwhile, the god Poseidon gave King Minos a beautiful prized bull in order for Minos to sacrifice it to the deity. But such was the bull's beauty, Minos could not bear to slay it and kept it for himself. This angered Poseidon, and to punish Minos, the god placed a curse upon the king's wife, Pasiphae. The curse made Pasiphae fall madly in love with the bull. Under the influence of the curse, she asked Daedalus to help her seduce it. Daedalus agreed to help. He constructed a hollow wooden cow so realistic that the plan worked. So with Pasiphae hiding inside the cow, she conceived and gave birth to a monstrous half-bull, half-human creature called a minotaur. Naturally, shocked and disgusted by the abomination, a furious King Minos blamed Daedalus for enabling the situation to occur, and ordered him to construct a labyrinth beneath the palace where the Minotaur would be kept. Upon the completion of the labyrinth, Minos then imprisoned Daedalus and his son Icarus within the top of the tallest tower on the island, where they were to remain for the rest of their lives. But of course, Daedalus was still a genius inventor, and whilst observing a flock of birds flying above the tower, he had the idea to construct 2 pairs of wings that he and Icarus would use to escape, flying away from their prison to freedom. Flight being something that only birds or gods had ever done before. Using feathers from the flocks that perched on the tower and wax from candles, Daedalus made the giant wings. As he strapped the wings to Icarus, he gave a warning: fly too low and the wings will become too wet and heavy, as they will be damaged by the waves of the sea. Fly too high and the heat from the sun will melt the wax and the wings will fall apart. The key to a successful escape would be to fly perfectly in the middle, not too low or too high. Here is an obvious reference to Aristotelian virtue and the golden mean as the ideal between deficiency and excess. But when Icarus leapt from the tower and spread his wings, he felt an incredible rush that made him feel godlike, and he became overconfident, ignoring his father's earlier warning. Daedalus, flying at a safer height, could only watch in horror as his son soared higher and higher. Powerless to save him, Daedalus's warning proved correct, and Icarus's wings collapsed under intense heat. Icarus then fell into the sea and drowned. Just as Daedalus himself had ignored the laws dividing men from gods many times before in the service of his own ego, Icarus had now done so as well. Ultimately, both men paid dearly for straying from the path of moderation, one with his life and the other with a life of regret. Herein lies the dangers of unrestrained technological advancements. Technology is now an embedded part of modern life, to such a degree that man cannot do without it. Thus, a sharp reduction in technological use, or in allegorical terms, flying too low, would be catastrophic for standards of living. But so would a sharp increase, or flying too high, as we may eventually lose sight of what it even means to be human, something that ought to be self-evident. Yet such is humanity's trajectory in the current epoch, that technology is gaining more and more influence over man already. This is happening at an alarming rate, but still not quite fast enough for the masses to express great concern. At which point, should they awaken to the possible dangers, a loss of one's self in technology may have already gone unnoticed, and it may be too late to turn back.